But tonight, to give the introduction for Miss Poole is a colleague and someone who's featured prominently in the book. Please give your warmest Books and Books welcome to Miss Mary Barley.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leslie Poole. She's a visiting assistant professor of environmental studies at Rollins College in Winter Park. She's an award-winning writer and historian. Her articles have been published in academic journals, and she regularly presents papers about her research at history conferences. In 2008, she appeared in the PBS documentary In Marjorie's Wake, which retraced a 1933 trip on the St. Johns River taken by noted author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlins. Poole was a reporter for several newspapers, including the Orlando Sentinel, where she helped pen a series of articles about Florida's lack of growth management that won awards and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. A fourth-generation Floridian, Poole has long been interested in the role of women in the state's environmental movement and how many of these women were saving state's important natural resources even before they were allowed to vote. She received her PhD in American history from the University of Florida. The subject of her research was the role of women in Florida's environmental movement. It involved 21 interviews with environmental activists who told about their issues, battles with the state. Her book, which uses much of that research, is Saving Florida: Women's Fight for the Environment in the 20th Century. It was published in May by the University Press of Florida, and why we have gathered here at Books and Books. I'm pleased to present Dr. Leslie Poole.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a real joy to be here at Books and Books, which may be like one of the best bookstores ever, don't you think? Yeah. I'm going to take you on a brief journey today through the 20th century and looking at different roles that women played in the environmental movement. I have a limited amount of time, so I won't be able to discuss the many, many women who were part of the movement, but you will find them in my book, and I'm delighted to say that two of them are with us tonight in our audience, so we'll be introducing you to them as well. So let's start with the beginning of the 20th century. The conservation movement arose in the late 1800s with the realization that a lot of America's natural resources were at risk, were dwindling and were disappearing. The bison was near extinction, and this had been a symbol of America throughout our history, and so many began to start to think about how we might better use our natural resources, and they looked at some of the different species that were in trouble. One of them, let me see, were wading birds. Now, why were birds in trouble? Well, as you can see with the snowy egret, when it's springtime and love is in the air, they put on extra plumes, and it makes them very attractive, which is wonderful if you're another egret, but not so good if humans value you better as a hat. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this was the fashion trend in the United States and overseas, was to have bird feathers and bird bodies adorn your hats and even your clothes. There was an account of a woman who had a dress hemmed with finch heads, believe it or not. And so with the fashion rage, it meant that many wading birds, including those found in Florida, were disappearing by the hundreds of thousands for a $17 million a year millinery and fashion industry. And as I mentioned, Florida was ground zero for much of the slaughter. And so a group of people gathered on a spring morning in Maitland, Florida, at the home of Clara Domerick. Clara had assembled the who's who of Orlando Winter Park in Maitland at her winter home, and there she wanted to discuss the creation of the Florida Audubon Society. The group was well organized, largely due to the women who were members of it, and they immediately began publicizing the problems of birds in Florida and seeking legislation from the state to help protect the birds as well. Catherine Bell Tippets of St. Petersburg was an early advocate of the Audubon Society, and she founded the St. Petersburg Audubon Society as well. She led the state drive to select a state bird and then extended it to other states in the United States, and led a petition drive, as pictured here, to save the robin in Florida. It was a 70-foot petition that they carried to the legislature in 1913 and got legislation to protect the bird as well. So it's interesting because this is pre-women's suffrage. They are getting things done. And how did they do it? Well, this is one of the things that really interests me is they were working in grassroots, working largely through women's groups to get things done. They used their connections. They used their talents. They went to Tallahassee and demanded that their legislation be passed. And sometimes they were ignored, but as one female historian noted, they resorted to what they called sandspur tactics, in which the legislators finally learned that the women were not going to go away and they might as well go ahead and pass their legislation now and get rid of their bothering them during the course of the legislature. One of the earliest environmental groups is the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, the statewide umbrella group of women's clubs throughout the state. The FFWC worked on the 1916 creation of Royal Palm State Park, which was the first state park in Florida. It was located on a hammock island in the Everglades, and members worried that its rich plant life and bird life might be decimated by development that was coming into the Miami area. For years, until they could get legislative approval, they funded and ran the park themselves. And it was the first time in the United States that women's clubbers had created a state park. The park later would become the nucleus of Everglades National Park. You can still go visit it today. The royal palms have largely disappeared through successive hurricanes. However, there is a marker that notes that at the creation of the Everglades National Park in 1947, that women's clubs had been very important in the creation of the protection for that area as well. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of Royal Palm State Park. May Mann Jennings was considered the most powerful woman in Florida, but I would argue she might have been one of the most powerful people in Florida as well. She was as powerful as many of the men long before she had the vote as well. The wife of a former governor, Jennings was president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs and was primarily responsible for getting Royal Palm Park created and funded. She was also known as the mother of Florida forestry for her successful efforts to gain state laws to protect and save Florida's forests. She also knew how to use her club women connections to get things done, a network her biographer calls an old girls club. For centuries, Florida's and much of the southeastern United States had been covered in longleaf pine. But the common practice until the early 20th century was to log or extract turpentine from the trees and move on, leaving decimated landscapes as well. It's estimated today that 98% of our longleaf pine forest has disappeared, making it one of the largest habitat losses in the world. Florida's club women and garden clubbers, including Jennings, were very alarmed and pressed for legislation to force better practices, which included replanting of trees and long-term thinking about how to handle forests. By the mid-20th century, times were changing for activist women. Although the Audubon Society had welcomed women's participation with men, most women conservationists had found their work within all women's clubs. But with a rising tide of women's rights in the mid-century and an emerging environmental movement, we start to see groups that not only are mixed with male and female, but some of them now are headed by women. A prime example of this is Marjorie Harris Carr. She was a bright, vivacious woman who had trained as a biologist. And when in the early 1960s, she learned from her garden club friend that there was a canal proposed to cut across the northern part of Florida, she was incredulous. It would destroy her beloved Ocklawaha River and that had been written about by poets and travel writers for decades. And using her Alachua Audubon connections, she went to work building a grassroots base in order to stop the canal. Most people thought it would be impossible to do so, and they discounted Carr. They called her a Micanopy housewife, which she didn't mind because, she would go to the meeting full of facts and she would eviscerate those who really discounted her abilities as well. And through the work of Carr and an organization she helped found called the Florida Defenders of the Environment, the barge canal was halted in 1971 by presidential edict. It was the first time in the United States that a large public works project so far along in construction was halted by the nation. Parts of it still exist today, and on her deathbed, Carr was hoping that it would be restored, and that's a project that remains for us today. In 1947, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, a journalist at her father's Miami Herald, wrote the book Everglades River of Grass, which really gave us the terminology to understand what the Everglades were all about. We still live by that definition today. But what you may not know is that it wasn't until Douglas was 79 that she actually became an activist on behalf of the wetlands. And she would become a formidable enemy, showing up in her floppy hat and thick glasses. She could put the fear in the hearts of any developer who was proposing to use some of the wetlands for development. She also founded the Friends of the Everglades, a group composed of men and women that continues her work today. By the early 1960s, the Miami area was booming with grand development schemes that were welcomed by local governments, blinded by dollar signs. One idea was to put a large oil refinery on the edge of Biscayne Bay near Homestead. Another was to connect all the uppermost keys by by causeways, dredge the bay bottom up, and create Islandia, which promoters hoped would rival Miami Beach. A small but vocal and talented group, the Safe Progress Association, rose up to challenge these proposals, and among them was a very important group of women. Sorry, somehow we lost that. Among them were Juanita Green, who wrote articles for the Miami Herald showing the folly of these projects. Belle Scheffel rallied garden clubs and environmental groups. Polly Redford wrote articles for national magazines detailing the potential destruction of the bay. Helen Muir, seated in the bottom picture with her friend Douglas, wrote about problems in the bay, and Miami City Commissioner Alice Wainwright, who's in the right of that photo, actually proposed preservation of the bay as well. The end result of the women's work, and that of many men as well, was the 1968 designation of Biscayne National Monument. In 1980, with the addition of more acreage, the monument became Biscayne National Park, one of Florida's 3 national parks. And it's the largest marine park in the national park system. It's a jewel that was preserved because some very brave people said no, and among them were some very strong women who made that happen as well. One of the major arguments against the Biscayne refinery was the inevitable air and water pollution that it would bring. By the mid-20th century, during the booming post-World War II years, it became apparent to many Floridians that the Eden they had moved here to enjoy was disappearing, and it was becoming befouled by raw sewage that was bubbling up into aquifers and air pollution from smokestacks from industry. There was one day in Jacksonville where women reported that their nylon stockings had melted due to air pollution as well. And people came to Florida to escape pollution, not to encounter it, and women were important activists against it, particularly on the issue of health. If it was affecting their children's health or their own health, they were rabid activists and didn't really care what the Chamber of Commerce had to say because their priorities were set elsewhere. The League of Women Voters has been a staunch ally of the environment. In 1956, the National League decided to focus its efforts on water, deeming it an issue of major public concern. The National League in 1971, after a year of study, decided to support federal air pollution standards on industrial production, government installations, fuel, and vehicles, opening the way for action on all levels by the League. In response, as I show here in this slide, the South County League of Women Voters in Boca Raton conducted a 6-month study of the effects of air pollution in Palm Beach County. The report named the sugarcane industry and transportation as the worst offenders, sending alarms through the league. Quote, "This area is beginning to get into the Los Angeles syndrome," a committee chair said. The same league, in celebration of Earth Day, came up with a series of rhymes based on Mother Goose, and I offer you one here. And a picture of my dog because, you know, it's my dog. Yeah. A growing field of advocacy in the late 20th century was environmental justice. It had become clear that the people who suffer first and most from hazardous chemicals in our society tend to be the poor, the ones who, and minorities, those who are unable to escape the impacts as well. The powerless in our society. In the early part of the century, many Florida club women worked to improve the circumstances of South Florida's Seminole people. They worked to secure land for the Seminoles, sent native children to schools, and helped market their handmade goods. Pictured here are two women who are my heroes. Joy Ezel, who has worked for more than 2 decades to clean up the Finn Holloway River, which is heavily polluted with cancer-causing dioxin from a paper manufacturing mill, and was given permission to do so by the Florida State Legislature. Jeannie Economos, who works tirelessly on behalf of Central Florida's farm workers, is also pictured here. She particularly works for those who used to work in the heavily polluted Lake Apopka region and now suffer a variety of health problems, including cancers and miscarriages and skin diseases as well. The second half of the 20th century we found women in Florida were becoming environmental leaders. Mary Grizzle served in the state legislature representing St. Petersburg. There she fought against water pollution, especially the dumping of untreated sewage in Tampa Bay. Again, that was standard practice throughout the state. Victoria Schinkel headed the most important environmental agency in Florida, the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation. And in 2000, Carol Browner led the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, arguably the most powerful environmental bureaucracy in the world. It was a long way from Clara Domerich's living room from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, but it's a signal of the rising importance of women and women's leadership in Florida and in the nation. Many of these environmental women are still working for Florida's environment today and going into the 20th century with some similar concerns and actions. They include Maggie Reno Herchala of Martin County and Mary Barley of Key Largo. Herchala, who's seated here with us tonight, grew up in the rural homestead area of Kendall, which is not so rural anymore, and as a child was schooled in Florida's outdoors by her newspaper reporter parents. Years later, while raising her 4 children in Stewart, she became involved in a number of environmental issues and eventually was the first woman elected to the Martin County Commission. There, she firmly pressed for managed, careful growth, gaining a number of opponents among property rights and others with vested interests. But her work there helped Martin County gain a reputation as a model of growth management, and she gained a reputation as well as a no-nonsense, straight-talking representative who continues to fight for Everglades restoration, preserving water resources, curbing urban sprawl, and saving wetlands. Mary Barley, who's also here with us tonight, came to love the Florida Keys while vacationing there with her husband, George. After massive algae blooms hit Florida Bay in the 1980s and 1990s, leaving the waters behind their home looking like pea soup, they realized that the health of their aquatic backyard reflected the health of the Everglades. George decided to devote all of his time to fight to improve the Everglades, while Mary ran their Orlando-based development company. When George died in a tragic 1995 airplane crash, Mary took over his cause, chairing the Everglades Foundation, where she now serves on the board. She's using her business expertise and scientific data to fight for the wetlands restoration. It's become her full-time cause, and she remains committed to supporting lobbying efforts on its behalf. Her sustaining words, quote, "The Everglades, it's a place worth saving." Mary may have been an unintentional activist, but like many women before her, once she engaged in an issue, she used facts and determination to oppose business, lobbyists, and governments whose interests may not have lay with the environment. And that's what this book is all about, women heroes for the environment. There are many, many more stories in it, and many that are missing because I simply didn't have the space. But as a 4th-generation Floridian, I continue to be thankful for their examples and hope that we can be worthy heirs to their passion and work. Thank you so much. And now I'm happy to take questions, and perhaps Maggie and Mary will take questions as well. Yes, ma'am.
I'm somewhat troubled when I go to things like the book fair that they have every year in November. And when you go to see any speakers that involve the environment, you see very few people under the age of 40. It's basically everyone is like 40 up. You don't see no one in the 30s, no one in the 20s. Who's going to carry on once we're all gone?
Well, I have to say, I teach environmental studies at Rollins College, and so I'm seeing the younger generation, and they are very, very engaged. I think they may be using different methodologies today. There's a lot of social media that maybe we aren't seeing, that's how they're talking amongst themselves. But I'm very hopeful. I'm just sad that we're leaving them such bad conditions in many ways as well. Perhaps, would you guys like to respond to that?
One of the things we're seeing in Martin County since we described the summer of 2013 as the summer of slime. We had blue-green algae, toxic blue-green algae throughout the estuary. We had signs grim-looking signs from the health department that basically said for 3 months you could not set your toe into estuary. And a bunch of young people who are busy raising their children, busy working, busy leading their life, formed River Warriors. And they have been fantastic. And they didn't go away. They have a float in the Christmas parade every year. We've been picketing the Water Management District every month. They're fantastic. But mostly, they're raising their children and they're making a living.
Right, and I agree with that. I think they don't have the time to spend doing things that we're doing in depth, but they will be there when the time comes. Right now, they've got families, they're driving their kids around to their schools and the things that they're trying to do, but they care, and they care in the same that Maggie was just telling you about. One guy got on the internet with his hashtag, I don't even
know what a hashtag is. I don't
some
either.
of these things
I've got one on me and I don't know what it is.
Through that, 5,000 people showed up at a demonstration. 5,000
That's
people.
impressive.
Right.
Impressive.
So they're there. They may not be as vocal and out front as we are, but they will be when their time comes.
And when they were doing studies when the 60s were blossoming, I forget who was doing it from which university, on talking to people about what they thought the environment, the standard line was the little old ladies in tennis shoes who didn't need to work, the retirees who didn't need to work were the only ones who didn't care if you screw up the place. Hayden Burns said of the smell in Jacksonville, smells like money to me. And the working people understand you need to be working. Well, he went and he surveyed the working people. And they cared more strongly about the environment. They cared more strongly about growth management. And they knew more about it because they were in Florida and had been for more than 2 years than the older ones. They were just busy raising their children and doing their jobs.
Again, sometimes this is where the health issues come in. I mean, that engages a lot of young families and mothers, along those lines. One of the activists I mentioned earlier says, it's like a mama bear. You don't want to mess with her if I feel like my children are threatened as well. But if we take Douglas's, starting at 79, we can get a lot done. She had 30 years of activism amongst her as well. But I think they're out there, maybe just not as visible as they used to be.
Well, they don't do it like we do it. They do it online. And we're doing it right now. There's an internet streaming right now. And so it's probably something we're not going to do when we go home. But they're watching and they care and they're getting, they're understanding and putting in their thought process that someday their passion will come out and they'll find a passion and they'll go for that too.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir?
Yeah. Did Marjorie Stoneman Douglas first become involved within the environment as a result of the Everglades jetport?
No.
Yes, as an activist, she did. Now,
Yes.
she had written about the Everglades long before that, and she had maintained an interest in it. But yes, it's a really funny story. Shall I tell it? Yes. Okay, so she stopped at a little store one night to buy cat food. And while she was in the aisles buying cat food, she saw a young woman that she knew was working on the jetport as an activist. And she said something to the young woman about, good for you, thank you for all you're doing. And the young woman turned to her and said, well, what are you doing? And Douglas said, and this she wrote in her autobiography, she says, well, I wrote the book. And the young woman said, that is not enough. And Douglas, and I'm paraphrasing her, said, in order to get away from her, she says, well, I'll do whatever I can do. And the next day, the jetport activists were on her doorstep asking her, to get involved. And one of the suggestions was, well, maybe you can create a support group. you know, and so she thought about it for a few months, and then she went to an outdoor festival, and she was sitting there, and a friend came up to her and said, well, what are you doing these days, Marjorie? And she says, well, you know, I'm thinking about starting a group. I'm thinking about calling it Friends of the Everglades, and I'm thinking, you know, maybe I'll charge everybody like $1 a year. And the man pulled out a $1 bill, put it down in front of her, and said, okay, I'm your first member. And that's how Friends of the Everglades began. And that she says, this is it gave her a whole new purpose in her life, was this new activism now. And so it's really a great story, and it's one I tell my students all the time. It's never too late. There's always something you can do. And while we haven't had a figure stand out as much as she did in today's world, I think there's one out there waiting, or maybe many of them.
Marjorie, as soon as she had started the Friend of the Everglades, got a friend's camper, brought along Michael, who she introduced to everybody as her illegitimate grandson, who was, I think, 25 and had a large red beard and long hair, brought along her friend Kitty, and they toured Lake Okeechobee, little town by little town, making speeches. And Marjorie could get away with it. Michael had a little problem in Okeechobee City. He was cornered in a bar and told, we don't like long hair here, son. And they wound up at my house, having had a wonderful time and gotten 100 new members.
So $1 at a time is how Friends of the Everglades began. So it's a great story.
And the thing to remember is you can never give up. So all you listening out there, we can never give up, because if we give up, we lose.
One of the women that I interviewed met Douglas later in life when she needed some help. She would go in and read to her. Douglas was almost blind by the end of her life, and she would go read to her. But before she ever started any of the reading, Douglas would ask her, so what have you been doing for the environment today? You know, there was just no let up. You know, there was just no, you've got to be out there, you've got to be doing something. And today she's running a center that's in Douglas's name out on Key Biscayne.
I asked Marjorie when she was at my house, I said, Marjorie, you're a good Quaker. Is there anything you've ever done to excess? She said, read, my dear.
Right. Nothing better than a good book.
Yeah, one of the things that interests me the most about these women that I've been working on is it's not just the feminist angle, but the idea of powerless people finding power. How do you go to Tallahassee and get bird protection when you can't even vote? You know, how do you get their attention? And it clearly was always through gathering facts, working in numbers, and constant pressure and media, using the news media as well. And they got very effective at it. And I think all the really effective ones kind of share all of those traits as well. Mae Jennings, when she wanted to get funding for Royal Palm State Park from the legislature, knew she was going to go up there, going to go by herself, but before she went, she contacted her women's club's friends and said, does anybody know anybody in Tallahassee? And so she was put in touch with the head of the Tallahassee women's clubs, who put her in touch with the governor's wife. And when Mae went to Tallahassee, she stayed in the governor's mansion, which is not bad for, someone, a powerless lobbyist who's going up to Tallahassee to get things done. So there's these hidden stories that really haven't been told about what women were doing and what their motivations were, and this is really what has interested me, and I hope that I've given them credit in this book as well. And many more topics, too, that we didn't even get to tonight. City beautification, planting trees, getting rid of billboards, stopping cattle from roaming in the cities, city planning, all of these kinds of things women were heavily involved in. Even though they may not have been sitting on the city commissions that were making these decisions, they were there, making their feelings known very clearly. Yes, sir.
You mentioned city beautification. Do you cover in any way Vivian Larimore Rader, the poet laureate of Florida, because she met Simpson at some point and she became very interested in tropical foliage and flowers, and she wrote about it, and she was very much involved in the planting of poinciana trees around Miami. And I know she taught at Rawlins. I don't know if you know.
She's not included in this book. I was looking, well, here's the thing. I keep getting names as I go around to different groups. I get more names. I think, oh, I wish I could have included them. What I try to do is go to all the different parts of the state and show that women were doing similar activities all over. And I think if you scratch the surface in any community, you can find women doing pretty much a lot of the same thing. In Winter Park, which is my town of residence right now, it was the women's clubs who were arguing that the city needed planning, they needed garbage collection, they needed to be a bird sanctuary, and the local garden clubbers, many of them who were women's clubbers, also had a big protest in the 50s where they all stood in front of bulldozers trying to prevent the destruction of 100 trees for a road widening project. And as I like to remind them, you know, that they stood in front of the bulldozers, they sat on tree limbs, they collected money in the streets, they had a petition drive, and they also had a refreshment table. That they, you know, but it took the sheriff coming out with legal papers to get them to cease and desist so that the trees could be torn down. So battle lost, but as a result of that, Winter Park became one of the first cities in the nation to adopt a tree ordinance. And although the local newspaper called them all vigilantes, there was headlines calling them that. 5 of these women were put on this tree board for the city, and one of them became the chair of it. So there's lots of these stories, I think, that are found throughout the state as well. And we have to mention, you know, not all the plants that they thought were beautiful, that made the state beautiful, were native, and some of them led to kind of some destructive problems, like water hyacinths, and, you know, but the... Yes, Brazilian peppers were pretty, I know. So there's, you know, this, we have to look at it too, the fact that they didn't really have a hard grasp of, you know, ecology until mid-century, and really didn't understand the long-term destructiveness of non-native species, which we are well aware of today as well. A number of women were also very involved in dealing with endangered species, you know, for fighting to get lights turned off on sea turtle nesting beaches. That ended up in federal court. Fighting to save manatees. That's also been a spark that has gotten a lot of women involved as well. So, all right, any more questions? Or, well, thank you again. I want to, will you all stand up, please? Maggie Herchala is here, and Mary Barley is here, and they've been some of our heroes. I'm just so happy that they're here today.
Folks, don't forget, the books are for sale behind the counter. Dr. Poole will sit over here and sign them for you. If you're watching online, don't forget, you can still give us a call. We'll get a book signed for you, and we'll ship it out. Thank you for coming. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant evening.